Savannah, Georgia, supposedly one of the most haunted cities in the U.S. There's no shortage of ghost stories, varying in degrees of truth for this old city. They know it too, and have ghost tours for you to go on. The first time I went, we didn't really see much of anything. Don't know if I just wasn't looking for the right things or what. A few years later, I went with another group of people, and we actually had some interesting things turn up, specifically on one of these ghost tours. Now, some of these tours are on a tram or something. They take you to staged areas and try to really dial up a show for you. Others, though, usually the walking tours, are a lot more low-key and feel closer to any would-be activity. We had a guide that admitted she wasn't necessarily a full believer in the paranormal, but had seen enough since living in Savannah to open her mind. We got some pictures of what was supposed to be an old Civil War hospital that had been repurposed as a bar, but only the lower floors. The upper floors were strictly off limits for reasons. We tried to take some pictures from across the street, granted this was some time back when digital zoom wasn't that great, and could make out some pale figures in the windows on one of those floors. Later on, we came to one of the city blocks that was supposed to be or had once been a burial plot for someone of importance, and the lady told us that people said their cell phone batteries would drain quicker if they hung around that spot long enough. We obviously didn't sit and stare at our phones, but I did snap a couple pictures. There's a random green streak in one of them, going off the edge of the picture. It wasn't a rainy or misty evening, and I don't recall seeing any green lights in that area. The weirdest thing, though, was outside the condemned house of a doctor from many years ago. Now, I'll fully admit this could be the power of persuasion, but the story goes that when yellow fever was running rampant through Savannah and hospitals were overflowing, this doctor took some of his patients in his own home and had tried to quarantine them from his family. Obviously, it was highly contagious, and his family ended up getting sick and dying, along with most or all of his patients. Left with extreme sadness and guilt, he eventually died alone, and his house was boarded up and never to be entered again. Our tour guide said that if you went up to the house, touched it, and opened your mind, you could feel the sadness, and that people in the medical field said it was especially distressing for them. This was the spirit of the doctor reaching out to try and tell people of his guilt. She said you had to verbally tell it to go away, otherwise it could stay with you for a while, and some people reported seeing an apparition at the foot of their bed after waking up in the night or next morning. I decided to try it, went in kind of skeptical, touched the house, said, "Okay, if anyone's there, let me know," and didn't immediately feel any rush of sadness. I started to walk away, but with each step I took, I felt heavier, like there was a literal weight on my shoulder. I tried to shake it off. Again, power of persuasion, right? But I just couldn't perk myself back up. I finally said, "Okay, you're gonna have to go, I'm sorry," and felt a good bit better. Could have been my imagination, but one of our group was a nurse and very left-brain, logic-based person, and she said she felt horrible just being near the house, so maybe there's something to it. A friend of mine from high school passed away a couple years after I moved away for college. It's a weird story. No one really seems to know how she died, and many consider it a social stigma to ask about the circumstances of an untimely death rather than just showing support for the family. So there we are, at a funeral for an otherwise seemingly healthy 21-year-old, most of us wondering what happened. Rumors began before the day of the funeral and started to blossom wildly a few days after. Although the old gang weren't in constant contact anymore, we did occasionally catch up and hang out and wanted to know what happened to our friend. A couple of people closer to her in those days noted there was a guy she started hanging around with for a few months before she died. He seemed okay, but a little odd, didn't want to be around groups of people for too long, would start physically cringing if he felt uncomfortable. She was pretty much a homebody too, so that didn't seem like it would be an issue, but they got more and more reserved until it got to where no one saw either of them for a couple of weeks. Then supposedly, because again, there were tons of rumors about what happened, he found her after a little time had passed, mysteriously dead. And even more odd, this guy wasn't at the funeral, supposedly had been around for family viewing, but didn't stay the whole time. So anyway, a few months pass and I'm coming back home for a visit. I swing through the cemetery on my way and stop over at her grave to have a moment. While I'm standing there, I catch a very particular scent on the wind. This girl almost always wore this one type of perfume. I can't remember the name. It was mildly sweet with a floral note. It's hard for me to describe, but I'd know it anywhere. And here it was again, at her gravesite. It was a bittersweet moment. I had this feeling like maybe she was still around in some capacity, but then that gave way to an odd chill of what if she was still around somehow, and suddenly I remembered I was in a graveyard and left quickly. A few months later, I came through town to visit again, and I stopped by the cemetery. It's late fall by this point, so it's getting dark pretty early. As I get out of the car, I get the feeling I'm not alone. It's not a creepy feeling, just that knowledge that someone else is around you. Very well could be someone else out here. I get over to her grave and stand in silence for a few moments before that same familiar scent hits me again. This time, it smells a good bit stronger. I don't get chills like I did the first time, but I do start looking around. No one in my line of sight who could be wearing it. Odd. So, I say a few words and start to walk away. As I do, I immediately start to feel eyes on me, and I start looking around quickly, trying to see if someone or something is stalking me. Nothing. I speed my pace up. It's almost last light, and I'm not going to be caught in the dark with whatever it is out there. As I get back to my car, the feeling of being watched fades, but as I look back toward the cemetery one last time, I feel like something is still keeping an eye on me from afar. I drive off, feeling goes away entirely. Now, there's part of me that wonders if it was my friend's spirit lingering, or maybe the spirit of someone else that wears the same perfume. But there's also this part of me that wonders if maybe someone, perhaps that guy friend of hers that no one's seen since her funeral, has had a hard time letting go, and has been spending extra time at the graveyard with something to remember her by. The more I think of it, the grass over her grave, already short because it was fall, did look a little thin, like someone had been laying there. I've always had very vivid dreams, some feeling completely out there and others feeling very real. I don't have nightmares often, but when I do, they can be awful. I went through a period a few months ago where I had dreams about being in houses with some presence that did not want me there. One was about some neighborhood I don't recall seeing in my life, but it was apparently a place I had to explore in this dream. I had to go inside this kind of duplex. One side of the house, everything seemed normal and almost cheerful. There were a couple of doors that took you to the other side, though, that I could just feel malice flowing through. For some reason, I had to go through that side of the house to get outside or something. My dreams work like video games, I don't know. And everything seemed dingy and uninviting, and there was something staring at me the whole time, almost like it was counting down until it would just descend on me. I would panic, trying to either get outside or find a door back to the pleasant side to somehow reset the anger that thing felt toward me. I had a handful of other dreams, some I remember more than others. One about me being in a large house that, again, felt like a regular house until I went into one of the bedroom closets, which was impossibly long, and looped upon itself a couple of times. This feeling of intense dread, like I was somewhere I didn't need to be, before ending up in some room that wasn't even connected to the house, but I at least felt safer in. This all came to a head when one dream put me back in a house I used to live in. There was this big metal door with a huge metal frame against a wall that certainly wasn't there in the real-life version of the house. I walked up to it slowly, again feeling pure hatred coming through this giant metal door. I cracked it open, and there was a small room with nothing but a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. That bulb was gently swaying and began to swing harder and start to flicker. There came a low but deafening drone of unexplainable noise, like a growl but deeply distorted. I was frozen. I couldn't fight or flee for a few seconds. Finally, I regained control and quickly slammed the door and ran into the nearby room where I saw, get this, one of my old pastors from church. Now, I don't really go to church very often anymore. It's not that I'm not religious or anything. It's more of a personal decision after seeing how selfish some people can be about their place in the house of the Lord. This pastor was one I had when I was in my early teens, and he had been just great. I thought a lot of him, and he had been kind of a mentor to me as I was growing into a young man. He would go on to leave that church, though, and I heard he had passed away a couple of years ago. But here he was, in my dream, looking quite a lot like I remembered him from 20+ years ago. If anything, he seemed even younger in this dream. Anyhow, I ran into the room and turned around to see him, and he simply asked, "What's wrong?" I pointed to the other room where the door was shaking and rattling like it was going to fly open any second. The dream version of my pastor walked straight toward the door and started chanting. It wasn't any prayer I had heard before, and I think there was even some Latin thrown in, which made sense in the moment because I remember my pastor studied quite a lot, and I think he knew some, but I have no idea how I conjured that in my dream. After some time of this chanting, the door stopped rattling and kind of just fell open slowly. I went around and looked inside. The light bulb was no longer flickering and was slowly swinging to a stop. There was no more noise or angry feeling coming from within. To go back to the video game analogy, it felt like we'd finally beaten some hard boss and could breathe easy. But before I turned around to thank my pastor, I woke up feeling quite refreshed, and I've had very few nightmares, virtually none dealing with that ominous presence since then. I think about this quite often. Was this just my imagination putting together an epic miniseries in my head? Or was there actually something lurking in my daily life that was creeping into my dreams? And did the spirit of an old pastor who had a profound impact on my childhood come down to ward it off? Hard as it is to believe, I kind of like that explanation better.